At 11:47 on the night of March 9, 1945, radar operators in a darkened bunker beneath Tokyo's Koto ward stared at their screens and saw a single blip crossing the Japanese coastline. The air raid sirens had not yet sounded. Outside, a cold wind moved through the narrow streets of the working-class districts along the Sumida River, where wooden homes stood shoulder to shoulder in blocks that stretched for miles. Inside the bunker, an officer lifted a telephone handset and hesitated. One plane was not a raid. One plane was reconnaissance, perhaps a stray, perhaps lost. By the time he understood what was happening, the first bombs were already falling, and within minutes, 279 more bombers would turn the night sky orange. Aboard the lead B-29 Superfortress, 26-year-old Staff Sergeant Robert Wallace sat at his radio station and watched the coastline appear through broken clouds. He was a radioman from Pennsylvania, a slight man with steady hands and a calm voice, and tonight he was flying in the nose compartment of a plane called Pride of the Yankees. Wallace had joined the Army Air Forces in 1942, trained at Scott Field in Illinois, and arrived in the Marianas in late 1944 as part of the 20th Air Force's XX-1 Bomber Command. He had flown 11 missions over Japan by early March, all of them high-altitude daylight raids against factories and airfields, and all of them had been frustrating. Bombs fell from 25,000 feet and missed their targets by miles. The jet stream pushed the Superfortresses past their aim points before bombardiers could release. Crews returned to Saipan exhausted, their bomb bay still half full, knowing they had accomplished almost nothing. Wallace's unit, the 314th Bombardment Wing, was stationed at North Field on Guam, a sprawling base carved out of coral and jungle on the island's northern plateau. The men lived in Quonset huts that baked in the daytime heat and leaked during the tropical storms that rolled in from the Pacific. Most of the aircrew were in their early 20s. Farm boys and factory workers and college dropouts who had learned to fly four-engine bombers in Texas and Kansas and now found themselves on a speck of land, 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Wallace himself had grown up in a small Pennsylvania town where his father worked in a steel mill. He had finished high school in 1936, worked odd jobs through the Depression, and enlisted the year after Pearl Harbor. He was not an officer, not a pilot, not someone who expected to be remembered. His job was to monitor radio frequencies, relay messages between the aircraft and ground controllers, and keep the communication systems working when flak tore through the fuselage. The new plan. In early March 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay, commander of XX-1 Bomber Command, made a decision that terrified his own crews. The high-altitude precision bombing campaign was failing. LeMay ordered a complete reversal of tactics. The next mission would be flown at night, at low altitude, with all defensive guns except the tail turret removed to maximize bomb load. The target would not be a factory. It would be a 4-by-3-mile rectangle of densely packed wooden homes in northeastern Tokyo, a zone the planners called Area I. The weapon would be incendiary bombs, thousands of them, clusters of napalm-filled tubes designed to ignite everything they touched. The mission was called Operation Meetinghouse. On March 8th, LeMay's staff officers briefed the crews in sweltering Quonset huts across Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Wallace sat with his crew and listened as an intelligence officer explained that they would fly without most of their ammunition, that they would come in at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, and that Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns would have clear shots at them in the moonlight. The room was silent. Some men thought it was suicide. Others thought LeMay had lost his mind. Wallace's pilot, a first lieutenant from Ohio, simply nodded and asked when they would take off. The answer was the next evening. But Wallace's crew would not fly with the main force. They had been selected as pathfinders, the first planes over the target, the ones who would mark the aim point for the bombers that followed. Instead of a full load of incendiaries, Pride of the Yankees would carry 184 M47 bombs, each one a cluster of incendiary bomblets designed to spread fire across a wide area. Their job was to lay down a giant burning X over the Koto and Chuo wards, near the docks in the heart of Tokyo's working-class neighborhoods. The main force, 255 more B-29s, would aim for that X and saturate everything inside it. Wallace understood what that meant. This was not a mission against steel and concrete. This was a mission against wood and paper, against homes, against people. He did not talk about it with the other radiomen. No one did. They loaded their gear, checked their radios, and walked out to the flight line in the late afternoon heat of March 9th. The first plane. At 5:36 in the evening, the first B-29 lifted off from North Field on Guam. It was not Pride of the Yankees. The mission planners had staggered the takeoffs, sending the bombers up at 50-second intervals to avoid congestion over the target. Wallace's plane was among the first dozen, part of a group of 24 pathfinders that would arrive over Tokyo in waves, coming from different directions to confuse the defenses. Behind them, the main strike force would take off over the next 2 hours, 325 B-29s in total, the largest raid XX-1 Bomber Command had ever launched. The flight north took 7 hours. Wallace sat at his radio station in the cramped forward compartment, monitoring frequencies and watching the sky darken through the plexiglass windows. The aircraft climbed to 10,000 feet, then leveled off and droned north across the empty Pacific. There was no fighter escort. The P-51 Mustangs, based on Iwo Jima, did not have the range for a night mission, and the Navy's carriers were committed to supporting the invasion of Okinawa, scheduled for early April. The B-29s were alone. At around 11:30, Wallace saw the Japanese coastline appear as a dark line beneath broken clouds. The pilot pushed the control yoke forward, and the Superfortress began to descend. The plan called for the pathfinders to come in at different altitudes, between 7,000 and 25,000 feet, to spread out the anti-aircraft fire. Pride of the Yankees was assigned an approach altitude of 8,000 feet. Wallace felt his ears pop as the plane dropped. The air grew warmer. Through the bombardier's window in the nose, he could see lights below, not the blackout he had expected, but scattered clusters of illumination along the coast and inland toward the city. At 11:47, the first Pathfinder crossed the Tokyo city limits. It was not Wallace's plane. It was one of the high-altitude guide ships, a B-29 stripped of bombs and loaded with extra fuel and radio equipment, circling at 25,000 feet to coordinate the attack. On the ground, radar operators saw it and hesitated. Japanese air defenses had been on alert for weeks, ever since the Americans captured Iwo Jima and moved their bomber bases 300 miles closer to the home islands. But a single plane was not a raid. The sirens stayed silent. 3 minutes later, the first Pathfinder bombers arrived. There were 4 of them in the first wave, including Pride of the Yankees, coming in from different directions at staggered altitudes. Wallace's pilot banked the aircraft and lined up on the approach heading, a northwesterly course that would take them over the Sumida River and into the target zone. The bombardier called out altitude and airspeed over the intercom, 7,800 feet, 230 miles per hour. The bomb bay doors opened and cold air rushed into the fuselage. At 11:51, the first bombs fell. The burning Wallace felt the aircraft lurch upward as the bomb load released. 184 M47 incendiary clusters tumbled out of the bomb bay, each one breaking open at 2,000 feet and scattering 38 smaller bomblets across the rooftops below. The bomblets were M69s, 6-pound tubes filled with napalm, a new jelly gasoline developed by chemists at MIT. When they hit, they exploded and sprayed burning gel in every direction. Wood ignited instantly. Paper walls flared. Tatami mats smoldered and then burst into flame. From 8,000 feet, Wallace watched the fires bloom. The bombardier had aimed for the intersection of 2 major streets in the Kodo ward, near the docks, and the bombs fell in a line nearly 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide. Within seconds, dozens of buildings were burning. The pilot banked the aircraft and circled back, climbing to 10,000 feet. Behind them, the other 3 Pathfinders in the first wave dropped their loads, each one aimed at a different corner of the target rectangle, forming the arms of a giant X that stretched across the Sumida River. By 11:55, the X was complete and burning brightly. On the ground, air raid sirens finally began to wail. Civilian fire brigades scrambled toward the Koto and Chuo wards, but the fires were already out of control. The wind, which had been light earlier in the evening, began to pick up, gusting to 15 and then 20 miles per hour. The flames spread from building to building, jumping narrow streets and alleyways, feeding on the densely packed wooden structures. 14 minutes after the first bombs fell, Tokyo's fire chief sent a message to the city's emergency command center. The fires could not be contained. Wallace's pilot held the B-29 in a wide circle at 10,000 feet. Their job was not finished. As a pathfinder, they were supposed to orbit the target and relay information back to the incoming strike force. Wallace sat at his radio and began transmitting coordinates and wind data to the main force bombers, which were now crossing the Japanese coast in a steady stream, one every few minutes. Through the side windows, he could see other pathfinders dropping their loads, adding more fires to the burning X. By midnight, 21 of the 24 pathfinders had bombed successfully. The target was a sheet of flame visible for 50 miles. At 12:14 in the morning on March 10th, the first bomber of the main strike force arrived over Tokyo. The pilot saw the burning X and aimed directly for it. His bombardier released, and 1,600 pounds of incendiary clusters fell into the inferno. 30 seconds later, another B-29 arrived and dropped its load. Then another. Then 5 more in quick succession. The bombers came in waves, staggered by altitude and direction, each one dumping its payload onto the fires below. Wallace watched from his circling pathfinder and realized he was seeing something no one had ever seen before, an entire city igniting at once. The fires began to merge. Individual blazes connected into larger ones, and those grew into firestorms, self-sustaining columns of flame that generated their own wind and sucked oxygen out of the air at ground level. The temperature in the target zone rose to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. Wooden beams exploded, metal roofs melted. Thousands of people tried to flee toward the river or into open parks, but many were overtaken by the flames or suffocated in the superheated air. Wallace could see the smoke rising to 15,000 feet, thick and black and lit from below by the orange glow of the fires. The smell of burning wood and something else, something he did not want to identify, seeped into the aircraft even at 10,000 feet. By 12:45, more than 100 bombers had attacked. By 1:15, more than 200. Wallace's crew stayed in their orbit, transmitting data, watching the city burn. The pilot asked over the intercom if they should head home, and the co-pilot, a general from the Pentagon flying as an observer, told them to stay. They stayed. The fuel gauges crept downward. At 1:45, with the main force still dropping bombs, the pilot finally turned the B-29 southeast and began the long flight back to Guam. Haibo, morning after. Wallace's crew landed at North Field at 8:30 in the morning on March 10th. The aircraft was streaked with ash. The ground crew stared at it and said nothing. Wallace climbed down from the forward hatch, his legs stiff from sitting, his ears ringing from the engine noise. Around him, other B-29s were landing at 50-second intervals, the same rhythm they had taken off in 12 hours earlier. Some of the bombers had holes in their fuselages from anti-aircraft fire. Others had burn marks from flying too low through the smoke. 14 aircraft did not return. 96 airmen were dead or missing. The intelligence officers debriefed the crews in shifts. Wallace sat in a stuffy room and answered questions about radio communications, enemy fighter activity, and the visibility over the target. He said the visibility had been excellent. He said there had been little fighter opposition in the early minutes of the raid, though Japanese pilots had become more aggressive as the attack progressed. He said the fires had spread faster than anyone expected. The intelligence officer wrote everything down and then asked if Wallace had any recommendations for future missions. Wallace thought for a moment and said they should carry more fuel. The officer nodded and moved on to the next crew. In Tokyo, the fires burned for 2 more days. When they finally subsided, almost 16 square miles of the city had been destroyed. 267,000 buildings were gone. Over 1 million people were homeless. The death toll was estimated at between 80,000 and 100,000, making it the single deadliest air raid of the war, more destructive than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki as individual events. Japanese commanders who had seen the first Pathfinder plane and dismissed it as a lone reconnaissance aircraft were now surveying a landscape of ash and rubble that stretched from the docks to the distant suburbs. The 10th Flying Division, which had been responsible for defending the capital, had been caught completely off guard by the low-altitude night approach. Fighters had prowled the coast without coordination, their pilots receiving no guidance from radar stations that had been too slow to react. By the time the magnitude of the attack became clear, the city was already burning. Wallace flew 7 more missions over Japan between March 10th and the end of the war in August. None of them were as large as Operation Meetinghouse, but all of them followed the same pattern: low-altitude night attacks with incendiary bombs, targeting urban areas in Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama. The Japanese defenses adapted, bringing in more searchlights and coordinating their fighter patrols with anti-aircraft batteries. But the raids continued. Wallace's job remained the same: sit at the radio, monitor the frequencies, relay messages, and try not to think too much about what was happening on the ground. The quiet return. Wallace was discharged from the Army Air Forces in October 1945 and returned to Pennsylvania. He was 26 years old. He found work as a telephone repairman, a job that used the technical skills he had learned as a radioman. He married a woman named Dorothy in 1947, bought a small house on the outskirts of town, and raised 3 children. He did not talk about the war. His wife knew he had been a radioman on a bomber, but she did not know which missions he had flown or what he had seen. His children knew even less. The medal he had been awarded, an air medal with oak leaf clusters for his missions over Japan, sat in a drawer in his bedroom, wrapped in tissue paper. He took it out once, in 1952, when his oldest son asked what it was for, and then put it back and never mentioned it again. When neighbors asked about his service, he said he had been in the Pacific and changed the subject. When veterans groups invited him to meetings, he declined. He worked 42 years for the telephone company, repaired lines in snowstorms and heat waves, and retired in 1987 with a pension and a certificate of appreciation. He lived quietly. He and Dorothy moved to Punta Gorda, Florida in 1990 into a retirement community near the Gulf Coast. He played golf twice a week, read history books, and watched documentaries about the war on public television. Sometimes he recognized footage of B-29s taking off from the Marianas, the long lines of bombers lifting into the tropical sky, and he would sit forward in his chair and watch without saying anything. Dorothy learned not to ask. The story surfaces. In 2009, a military historian named Don Moore was researching the firebombing campaign against Japan for a book on the 20th Air Force. Moore had access to declassified mission reports, crew rosters, and debriefing transcripts from XX-1 Palmer Command. While reading through the files for Operation Meetinghouse, he noticed the name of the lead Pathfinder aircraft, Pride of the Yankees. The crew roster listed a radio operator named Robert Wallace. Moore, who lived in Florida, ran a search for Wallace's name in veteran databases and found an address in Punta Gorda. He wrote a letter. Wallace received it in June 2009 and did not open it for 3 days. When he finally did, he sat at his kitchen table and read it twice. Moore was asking if he would be willing to talk about the Tokyo raid, to share his memories for a historical project. Wallace was 87 years old. He had not spoken about March 9, 1945, in 64 years. He called Moore a week later and agreed to meet. They sat in Wallace's living room on a hot afternoon in July, and Wallace talked for 3 hours. He described the takeoff from Guam, the long flight north, the cold air rushing into the fuselage when the bomb bay doors opened. He described the fire spreading below, the burning X, the smell of smoke at 10,000 feet. He described the silence among the crew on the flight home, the way no one spoke about what they had seen. Moore recorded everything and later published an article in a military history magazine. The article caught the attention of researchers at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas. They invited Wallace to speak at a symposium on the strategic bombing campaign in 2010. He accepted, and in March of that year, 65 years after Operation Meetinghouse, he stood in front of an audience of historians, veterans, and students and told his story. He spoke for 20 minutes. When he finished, the room was silent. Then an elderly Japanese man in the back row stood and bowed. The man's name was Hiroshi Tanaka, a survivor of the Tokyo firebombing who had been invited to share his own memories. They shook hands afterward and spoke briefly through a translator. Tanaka said he did not blame Wallace. Wallace said he was sorry. The last years, Wallace returned to Florida and continued the quiet routines of his retirement. He gave a few more interviews over the next 2 years, always careful to emphasize that he had been one small part of a massive operation, that the real story was not about him, but about the thousands of men who flew the missions and the hundreds of thousands of people who lived through them. He died in 2012 at the age of 90 of heart failure in a hospital in Punta Gorda. Dorothy was with him. His children were with him. He was buried in a veterans cemetery outside town with a simple headstone that listed his name, his rank, and his years of service. Operation Meetinghouse remains the deadliest air raid in history. The Pathfinder crews who flew in first, like Wallace's, were never formally decorated for their role in the mission. Their contribution was recorded in mission reports and debriefing transcripts, filed away in archives, and largely forgotten. The men who survived went home, found work, raised families, and rarely spoke about the night they marked a city for destruction. Robert Wallace was one of them, a telephone repairman from Pennsylvania, a radioman who sat at a station in the nose of a B-29 and watched a burning X spread across Tokyo. He was 26 years old on the night of March 9, 1945, and he lived another 67 years without ever claiming he was a hero. He was simply a man who did the job he was trained to do in a war that demanded terrible things from ordinary people. If stories like this matter to you, a like or a subscribe quietly tells the algorithm to show them to more people who don't want history to disappear. The Japanese commanders in Tokyo saw what they thought was one plane, maybe two, crossing the coast that night. By the time they understood what was happening, the sky was full of bombers and the city was burning. The Pathfinders had done their job. The fires they started lit the way for 279 more aircraft, each one carrying 1.5 tons of incendiary bombs, and together they turned 16 square miles of a city into ash. Wallace never forgot. He never spoke about it for most of his life, but he never forgot. Near the end, when the historian Don Moore asked him if he had any regrets, Wallace sat quietly for a long time and then said he wished the war had ended some other way. But it had not, and so he and men like him had flown north on a March evening in 1945, crossed the Japanese coast in the darkness, and done what they were ordered to do. Most of the war was fought by people like Robert Wallace, ordinary men from small towns, doing jobs they never imagined they would do, in places they had never heard of before the war. They came home and said nothing. They worked and raised families and grew old. Their stories survived only because someone thought to ask, decades later, before it was too late. If you're watching this, drop a comment and let us know where you're from. And if any of your relatives served in the war. The comment section is part of keeping these memories alive, part of making sure people like Robert Wallace are not forgotten.